At 2 a.m., in a room no one ever enters, she quietly wiped the dust from the chalkboard and began writing again on a problem no one had solved for 22 years. Harvard University, Department of Mathematics, Burkhoff Building. Outside, snow was falling, slow and steady, like memory that refused to fade. The hallway lights had gone dark hours ago. From behind the door of room 402, a faint yellow glow escaped into the quiet corridor. Inside, a woman moved gently across the blackboard, wiping away faded chalk. Her uniform was plain, her name tag crooked, her movements unhurried, practiced. Elena Rodriguez had worked the night janitor shift at Harvard for more than 7 years. Few people ever asked her name. To most, she was just the cleaning lady. But to Elena, this place was something else entirely. A quiet cathedral of minds, where every discarded page, every erased formula, whispered of greatness, of thought, of struggle. Each night, after the professors left and the students fell asleep in dorms, Elena opened the trash bins carefully. From the scraps, she collected pieces, notes on Hilbert spaces, old problem sets, handwritten questions with no answers. She kept the ones with scribbles in the margins. There was something alive in those scribbles, something unfinished. Sometimes, after her last mop stroke, she would sit in the back of a dark classroom and read by the light of her flashlight. Integration by parts, Fourier transforms, series expansions. She taught herself slowly, page by page, as if trying to pick up where her life had once paused. At 15, she had won second place at the Massachusetts State Math Olympiad. Her teacher had told her she could go far. But 2 months later, her father died. Her mother collapsed into silence. Her sister was 3 years old and hungry. Elena dropped out. She cleaned houses. Then she worked at a diner. By 17, she had a daughter of her own. School faded into the distance. Her mind didn't. Tonight, the board still held notes from an advanced seminar, written in chalk, faint but clear, Navier-Stokes' existence and smoothness. Beneath it, the notations of fluid motion, compressions, velocity fields, pressure gradients. Elena stared at them as if they were old friends she never dared to speak to. This equation, this mystery, had haunted the mathematics world for decades. One of the 7 Millennium Prize problems. The question was simple to ask. Under what conditions do solutions to these equations exist? And are they smooth? She had followed its trail for months now, reading cast-off textbooks, watching online lectures late at night, when her daughter finally fell asleep. She had questions of her own. What if the velocity field could be expressed as a convergent series under compact assumptions? What if a hidden symmetry in the external force fields softened the nonlinear explosion? She didn't know what made her reach for the chalk. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the board. She drew a line, then a curve, then began to write terms carefully, starting with an expression that described energy dissipation under directional resistance. Then came a decomposition of the velocity into smaller components. Her handwriting was unsure, but the thoughts behind it were not. She wasn't trying to solve the problem. She was trying to understand why it still stood. The door opened behind her. She turned. A man stood at the threshold. Professor Charles Whitman, senior faculty in applied mathematics. He had returned for a forgotten flash drive. His eyes moved past her to the chalkboard. There, written in uncertain white, was a derivation. Not complete, but precise, focused. A fresh attempt at bounding energy dissipation using compact vector fields and adjusted gradients. He asked quietly, "Who wrote that?" Elena's voice caught in her throat. I'm sorry. I know I shouldn't be here. I just wanted to try something." He stepped closer. His eyes read the lines again. It wasn't random. It wasn't guesswork. It was a mind that had thought deeply about the structure of turbulence, about how fluid energy spreads and breaks apart under internal strain. "You understand more than most of my students," he said. Elena looked down at her shoes. She said nothing. A week later, she was called into the department office. Some of the faculty had already heard. Some were doubtful. Professor Whitman stood beside her and spoke. "I would like to invite Ms. Rodriguez to audit the graduate seminar on partial differential equations. Her approach to the Navier-Stokes problem is exceptional." But Elena only shook her head gently. "No, thank you," she said. "I don't want attention. I just want to learn again. Could I maybe start with Calculus 1? Whitman paused, then nodded. Outside, snow kept falling. Inside her, a quiet flame began to glow. The lecture hall smelled faintly of chalk and polished wood. Morning light streamed through the high windows, scattering across rows of desks filled with laptops, coffee cups, and restless energy. Students hurried in with backpacks slung across their shoulders, talking in the quick voices of youth. Elena sat quietly in the very last row, her notebook closed in front of her, her pen trembling in her hand. She had not sat in a classroom like this in more than 20 years. She felt the difference immediately. The students around her were barely 18, still full of the freshness of high school. She was nearly 40, her back sore from last night's shift, her eyes heavy from too little sleep. Her uniform was gone, replaced with an old sweater and jeans. She tried to shrink into the shadows, as if she could disappear into the woodwork. She was here, she reminded herself, not as a janitor, not as a curiosity, but as a student again. That thought alone was both terrifying and exhilarating. Professor Dana Chen entered briskly, her heels clicking on the floor. She was young, but carried herself with the poise of someone completely at home in mathematics. She scanned the room, her eyes pausing for a moment on Elena before she began. "Calculus," she said, her voice steady, "is the mathematics of change. It is the study of motion, of limits, of growth and decay. Without it, we cannot understand the world. With it, we begin to see patterns hidden in the smallest corners of nature." Elena leaned forward, her heart racing. It felt as though Chen's words were meant for her alone. Change, motion, limits. She had lived those words in the most painful sense. Dropping out of school, raising a child alone, mopping hallways at night. And yet here she was, allowed for the first time in decades to sit and listen, to learn not because she was cleaning up after someone else, but because she belonged in the room. The professor drew a curve on the board, a simple parabola. "This," she said, "is the distance of a ball over time. The question is, how fast is it moving at a single instant?" She drew a tangent line. "This line tells us the slope, the derivative. The derivative is the speed, the truth of the moment. Calculus allows us to pin down the instant between what was and what will be." Elena copied carefully. She remembered fragments of this from her youth, but it felt different now. She understood more deeply because she understood loss and time. A derivative was not just a line on paper. It was the measure of how fast a life could change direction, how a family could collapse in a single year, how hope could vanish, and then, sometimes, how it could return. During the break, the girl sitting next to her turned and grinned. She wore purple headphones around her neck and doodled constantly on her tablet. "Hey," she said, "are you, like, auditing? You're not a teaching assistant, right?" Elena shook her head, smiling faintly. "Just starting again." The girl's grin widened. "Cool. I'm Riley. I'm terrible at math, so maybe we can fail together." Elena laughed, a small sound she had not made in weeks. Something eased in her chest. She wasn't alone. That night, after finishing her cleaning shift, she found herself unable to rest. She unlocked a small storage closet in the basement and pulled out a whiteboard she had rescued from the trash months ago. In the dim light of the janitor's break room, she propped it against the wall and began to rewrite the lecture from memory. She drew the parabola, then the tangent line, then wrote out the definition of the derivative. The slope of the curve as the interval between 2 points shrinks smaller and smaller, approaching 0. She whispered the words as she wrote. The limit of the difference quotient, the slope of change at a single instant. She stepped back, staring at the shaky lines she had drawn. They weren't perfect, but they were hers. She was not copying anymore. She was owning the knowledge. A feeling stirred in her chest, something she had not felt since she was a girl, the thrill of understanding. Over the weeks that followed, Elena built a rhythm. In the mornings, she sat in the back row of Chen's class, taking careful notes, answering only when called upon. At night, she worked her janitor shift, repeating formulas in her mind as she pushed her mop down the quiet halls. She practiced on napkins during lunch breaks, scribbling limits and integrals next to her sandwich. Slowly, the fog began to lift. The numbers were no longer strangers. They were becoming companions. Professor Chen began to notice. After one quiz, she paused as she handed Elena her paper. You have a strong intuition for this, she said softly. Do you have a background in mathematics? Elena hesitated. She could have told her the whole story, the Olympiad, her father's death, the long years of silence, but instead she simply said, I left school a long time ago, but I never stopped learning. Chen nodded as if that made perfect sense. And perhaps it did. At home, her daughter Lucia watched her with wide eyes. Mom, she said one evening, are you doing homework like me? Elena smiled. Yes, I have homework too now. They worked side by side at the kitchen table, Lucia with fractions, Elena with derivatives. Sometimes Elena explained what she was learning. See, when we know how far something moves, calculus lets us find how fast it moves at any instant. Like when you're running, you're not always the same speed. Calculus tells us exactly how you're changing, step by step. Lucia giggled, proud that her mother was now a student too. But beneath the surface, Elena felt the pull of something larger. The folded page from the Navier-Stokes lecture still lay hidden in her binder. She did not dare unfold it often, but whenever she did, her heart beat faster. Existence and smoothness. She was not ready for it yet. Professor Chen's lectures were already more than enough. But she sensed that every new limit, every new slope she understood, was like a stone in a bridge leading back to that impossible river. One afternoon, as Chen explained the concept of the definite integral, Elena's mind drifted. Chen drew a curve and shaded the area beneath it. This is the accumulation of change, she explained. If a derivative tells you the speed at a moment, the integral tells you the total distance traveled. Elena's thoughts leapt to her own life. Each small act, each cleaning shift, each whispered study session, each night she stayed awake, was like a tiny piece of area under the curve. Alone, they seemed small, but together, they were building something vast. After class, Riley caught up with her. You're really good at this, she said, half accusing. I'm struggling. Can you help me with limits? Elena hesitated, then agreed. That evening, they met in the library. For 2 hours, Elena explained the concept slowly, using simple examples. Walking across a room, filling a glass of water. Riley nodded, eyes widening. That makes sense, she said finally. You should be the one teaching, not me listening. Elena flushed, shaking her head. But secretly, she felt a quiet warmth. The snow outside began to melt as spring arrived. Elena continued her double life, student by day, janitor by night. Sometimes the exhaustion weighed on her so heavily she thought she might collapse. Yet each new page of notes, each new problem solved, gave her strength. For the first time in decades, she was moving forward, not just surviving, but learning. One night, after finishing her shift, she sat alone in the lecture hall. The board was clean, waiting. She picked up a piece of chalk and wrote a single sentence at the top. "Every limit is a point you can approach." She stared at the words for a long time. They felt like more than mathematics. They felt like her life. Slowly, steadily, again and again, approaching the place she had once lost, and perhaps could one day find again. Outside, the spring snow had stopped. Inside, Elena, something steady had begun to grow. The night air over Harvard was still, but inside the old mathematics building, silence carried its own weight. Elena's shift had just begun. Her cart creaked softly against the tiled floors, the familiar sound of her second life. The mop, the rags, the bottle of diluted ammonia, tools that marked her place in the world. Yet as she moved down the empty corridor, she felt the tug of another world, a quieter world of symbols and whispers waiting on chalkboards behind closed doors. She had now been in Professor Chen's calculus class for 6 weeks. She sat every morning in the last row, a 40-year-old woman among teenagers, her notebook filling steadily with curves and slopes, with rules of differentiation and theorems of limits. The pace was brisk, too brisk for someone who had left school 2 decades earlier, but her hunger drove her forward. At night, she replayed Chen's words as she scrubbed the floors. A derivative is the measure of change, a slope in the moment, a glimpse of the instant between past and future. She whispered these lines under her breath as though they were prayers. Change, motion, limits. These were not abstractions to her. They were the story of her life. Every twist of fate, every hardship, every fragment of hope could be measured in change. She thought of leaving school at 16, of watching her father's coffin lowered into the ground, of her daughter's birth. Each moment a sudden derivative, sharp, unavoidable. Now, sitting in a classroom again, she felt another kind of change, softer but insistent, a new curve she had just begun to climb. Lucia noticed too. Her daughter came home one afternoon waving her own worksheet of fractions. "Mom, you have homework like me now." Elena laughed, but the words pierced her heart. At the kitchen table, mother and daughter worked side by side, their pencils scratching in rhythm. Elena explained slopes by comparing them to Lucia's dance steps. "See, you don't move at the same speed all the time. Calculus is like catching your speed at the very instant your foot touches the floor." Lucia giggled, proud. Elena thought, not for the first time, that perhaps the true gift she could give her daughter was not money or comfort, but the sight of her mother learning again. Yet beneath all of this ran a deeper current. The folded page from the Navier-Stokes lecture still lay hidden in her binder. She avoided it most days, afraid of what it demanded of her. But it never stopped calling. Existence and smoothness. She remembered Professor Whitman's startled look weeks before when he had caught her scribbling on the board. His words had stayed with her. "You understand more than most of my students." She had dismissed it then, but the thought kept returning like a tide. One night, she lingered again in room 402 after finishing her cleaning rounds. The board was clean, the air faint with chalk dust. She stared at the blank space and felt the old hunger rising. She picked up a stick of chalk and began, not with the Navier-Stokes, but with something smaller. She drew a parabola, then wrote its derivative, a line sloping downward. She whispered aloud what Chen had said. The line tells us the truth of the change. Her voice was shaky, but her heart swelled. She added another line, then another. Curves and slopes, derivatives of derivatives. Acceleration, then the rate of acceleration. She began to see how the simple became complex, how motion itself deepened layer by layer. The door opened behind her. She froze. Again, it was Whitman. He stepped in quietly, his coat still dusted with snow. But this time there was no surprise in his eyes. He simply watched her for a moment before saying, "You keep coming back." Elena set down the chalk quickly. "I was only practicing what we did in class," she murmured. Whitman walked forward, examining the board. He saw the parabola, the tangent lines, the scribbled notes. His gaze softened. "Practicing is good," he said. "Practicing builds muscle." "But you know, Elena, you're building something else too. You're building a way of seeing." She said nothing, uncertain how to answer. He picked up the chalk. "Let me show you something." In swift strokes, he wrote an inequality she recognized but did not fully understand. "This is called an energy estimate," he explained. "We use it when dealing with partial differential equations like Navier-Stokes. Even when we cannot solve the whole equation, we can still bound how wild the solution can grow. Think of it as holding turbulence inside a cage. The cage may be wide, but at least we know it exists." He pointed to a term. "This part represents the velocity squared, energy and motion. What makes the Navier-Stokes problem so hard is turbulence, when flow becomes chaotic, unpredictable. But energy estimates remind us, even chaos has boundaries." Elena followed the lines with her eyes. She recognized fragments from textbooks she had skimmed late at night. But hearing it spoken aloud, explained patiently, felt different. It felt possible. Her throat tightened. "I'm not a mathematician," she whispered. Whitman tilted his head. "Not yet." That night, she returned home unable to sleep. The image of the inequality blazed in her mind. She lay awake listening to her daughter's steady breathing in the next room. On her nightstand sat 2 notebooks, one filled with calculus exercises, the other with copied fragments of fluid dynamics. She stared at them, side by side, and wondered if they were not 2 paths but one. Slowly, carefully, she reached for the second notebook and opened it. The folded Navier-Stokes page stared back at her. She touched the words with trembling fingers. Existence and smoothness. She closed the book again, but her heart beat faster. Weeks passed. Elena's confidence grew. She raised her hand in class more often, her answers precise. Riley, the girl with headphones, began sitting beside her regularly, joking that Elena was her secret tutor. Together they studied in the library, Elena explaining limits and convergence with the patience of someone who had taught herself the hard way. Chen began giving her extra reading, introductions to real analysis, sequences, the beginnings of proof. Each new idea was like a candle lit in a dark room. Still, the tension inside her remained. She was still a janitor. She still scrubbed floors at midnight. And she still carried the folded page like a secret. Sometimes, when the halls were quiet, she dared to unfold it and trace the symbols with her finger, whispering the question aloud. Do solutions always exist? Are they always smooth? One evening, as she pushed her cart past the science center, she noticed a cluster of students gathered outside. A flyer taped to the door caught her eye. Guest lecture. The Future of Mathematical Physics, Navier-Stokes and Beyond. The speaker was a visiting scholar from Princeton. Elena felt her chest tighten. She longed to enter, to sit among them, to hear words she might not yet understand. But her shift had begun. She pressed her palm to the cold glass and watched through the window as the lecture continued. Faces animated, chalk flying across the board. She turned away at last, her heart heavy. Later that night, back in room 402, she stood once again before the empty board. She picked up the chalk and began copying the inequality Whitman had shown her. Line by line, she whispered the words. Energy cannot grow without bound. There must be structure underneath. She repeated it like a prayer until her eyes blurred. And then, almost without thinking, she wrote something new. A rearrangement of terms, a small shift in the balance. It was nothing more than an idea, a seed of an approach. Yet when she stepped back, she felt a shiver down her spine. It was as though the proof itself had whispered to her, faint but alive. She dropped the chalk, her breath quick. For a long time she simply stood there, snow drifting against the windows, silence pressing close. She was only a janitor. She was only a mother. But tonight, for a fleeting moment, she was also something else, a mathematician listening to the whisper of proofs. The spring air in Cambridge carried the smell of thawed earth and rain, but inside Harvard's mathematics department, the atmosphere was sharper, edged with murmurs. Word had begun to spread. A few students had noticed the janitor sitting in the back of calculus wine. Others whispered about seeing her late at night in classrooms, chalk in hand. And then there was the more astonishing rumor that Professor Whitman himself had spoken of her in faculty meetings, mentioning an insight she had made on an energy estimate connected to Navier-Stokes. For Elena, the whispers were a burden she had not asked for. She still cleaned the same corridors, pushing the same heavy mop, lifting trash bins with her tired arms. But sometimes, as she passed through the hallways, she felt eyes on her, quick, curious, sometimes skeptical. She lowered her gaze and worked faster. She wanted no recognition. She wanted only to learn. Yet whispers have a way of growing. One morning in Professor Chen's class, as Elena took her usual seat in the last row, she felt a flicker of tension. A group of students in the front row turned, looking at her with barely concealed smirks. One of them, a boy with a Harvard sweatshirt too large for his frame, leaned toward his friend and muttered loudly enough to be heard, "There's the prodigy janitor." Laughter rippled. Elena's cheeks burned. She fixed her eyes on the board, gripping her pen so tightly her hand ached. Chen ignored the noise, beginning her lecture on the fundamental theorem of calculus. She spoke clearly, her chalk tapping out proofs across the board. Elena forced herself to listen. The theorem tied together the two central ideas, derivatives and integrals, showing that they were not separate, but mirrors of one another. Change and accumulation, instant and whole. It was beautiful, and for a while Elena lost herself in the steady rhythm of Chen's voice. After class, Riley caught up with her. "Don't listen to them," she said, her face flushed with indignation. "They don't know anything about you." Elena smiled faintly. "It's all right," she whispered. But in truth, it was not all right. The words stung. For years, she had hidden in shadows, unseen. Now, under the light, she felt exposed. That evening, during her shift, she carried her cart past a seminar room. Through the window, she saw a cluster of graduate students gathered around a chalkboard. They were arguing, their voices sharp, their equations spilling across the surface in white lines. She paused, listening. The words drifted out. Weak solution, turbulence, non-linear blow-up. Her heart leapt. These were terms she had read in old papers, terms tied to the problem that haunted her. She longed to enter, to ask questions. But she knew how it would look. The janitor interrupting a graduate seminar. She moved on. Later that night, she found herself again in room 402. She picked up the chalk, writing slowly. She copied from memory what she had overheard. Weak solutions. She wrote beneath it the idea she remembered. A weak solution is one that satisfies the equations not exactly, but in an averaged sense, across test functions. It was like saying, even if the water was too wild to follow at every point, you could still capture its behavior in the whole. She thought of her own life, messy, turbulent, unpredictable. Perhaps she too was only a weak solution, holding together not at every instant but in the larger sense, across years of struggle. The door opened again. Whitman stepped in. His expression was serious. "You should be careful, Elena," he said quietly. "Not everyone here will welcome what you're doing." She froze. "I don't want trouble," she whispered. "I only want to learn." Whitman nodded. "I know. But mathematics is not just equations. It is people. And people can be proud, fearful, protective of their territory." He paused, then added, "But don't let that stop you. You see differently. That is rare." The next day, Chen asked Elena to stay after class. "I've noticed your progress," she said, her voice calm but warm. "You have the discipline of someone who has learned in silence for a long time, but you must be ready. Some of the students are curious, some are jealous. You will have to hold steady." Elena lowered her eyes. "I'm not here to compete. I just want to find my way back." Chen nodded. "Then keep going. Let the mathematics be your anchor." Still, the shadows of doubt grew. One afternoon, as she passed through the library carrying her mop, she overheard two graduate students whispering. "Whitman's gone soft, talking about a janitor with ideas on Navy or Stokes? Ridiculous." The words cut deep. She hurried past, her throat tight. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at her notebooks. For the first time in weeks, she felt the old temptation to stop, to let the flame go out. Perhaps it was foolish. Perhaps she was reaching for something she could never hold. Lucia found her there, head bowed over blank pages. "Mom," she said softly. "Are you okay?" Elena looked up, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, my love. Just tired." But Lucia climbed onto her lap, wrapping small arms around her neck. "Don't stop, Mom," she whispered. "You tell me to keep going when my dance is hard. You have to keep going, too." Tears pricked Elena's eyes. She kissed her daughter's hair, holding her close. The words of a child became the strength of a mother. The following week, Chen introduced the class to the concept of sequences and convergence. Elena listened intently. A sequence, Chen explained, is a list of numbers marching forward. Convergence means they settle, approaching a single point. Not all sequences converge. Some wander forever. But when they do, they reveal stability hidden in change. Elena copied carefully, her mind racing. Was that not her life? Years of wandering, years of turbulence, finally approaching something steady, something true. That night, she returned to room 402 with new determination. She drew on the board the inequality Whitman had shown her weeks before, the energy estimate. Beneath it, she added notes from Chen's lecture. Sequences, convergence. Slowly, she began to weave them together, searching for a connection. Could energy estimates be thought of as sequences converging to a bound? Could turbulence, wild as it was, be caged by the idea of convergence? She did not know, but the chalk felt alive in her hand. The room seemed to hum. She did not hear the footsteps until too late. A graduate student entered, his arms full of books. He stopped short when he saw her. His eyes narrowed. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. Elena froze, chalk in hand. I was just practicing," she whispered. He stared at the board, then back at her. "This is not your place," he said coldly. "You should leave the mathematics to the mathematicians." The words cut sharper than she expected. She lowered the chalk, murmured an apology, and left. All night the words echoed in her mind. Not your place. She cleaned the halls mechanically, her thoughts heavy. Was he right? Was she trespassing where she did not belong? Yet as dawn approached, she remembered Chen's voice. Let the mathematics be your anchor. And she remembered Lucia's whisper, Don't stop, Mom. Slowly, the doubts eased. She realized something. Place is not given. Place is built, line by line, proof by proof, step by step. When she returned home, she opened her notebook and wrote across the top of a fresh page, Weak solutions, energy estimates, convergence. Beneath it she wrote in smaller letters, I belong. She did not know yet where the journey would lead, but she knew she would keep walking it. Outside, spring rain began to fall. Inside, Elena's quiet flame burned steadier than before. The invitation came on a plain sheet of paper slipped under her door. At first, Elena thought it was a mistake. She turned it over in her hands, reading it twice, then a third time. Graduate seminar on partial differential equations. Guest participation welcome. Tuesday, 7 p.m. Room 201. At the bottom, in hurried handwriting, was a note. I think you should come. CWW. She folded the paper carefully, her hands trembling. A seminar. She had imagined such gatherings from afar, groups of scholars debating proofs, writing furiously on chalkboards, their voices layered with certainty. She had never believed she might sit among them. For the next 2 nights, she could not sleep. She mopped the hallways as always, her body moving out of habit, but her mind circling endlessly. What if they laughed? What if she understood nothing? What if they told her she had no right to be there? But Lucia noticed her unease. What's wrong, Mom? She asked at dinner. Elena hesitated, then handed her the folded note. Lucia read it slowly, her brow furrowed. They want you to come, so go. Elena smiled sadly. It's not that simple. But Lucia shook her head. It is. You always tell me to be brave. Now you have to be brave. On Tuesday evening, Elena arrived early. She wore her plainest clothes, her old notebook tucked under her arm. The seminar room was smaller than she expected, with long tables arranged in a rectangle. A chalkboard covered one wall. She sat near the corner, silent, watching as students and professors trickled in. Their voices filled the space, quick, confident, carrying words like Sobolev space, Fourier transform, weak convergence. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She wanted to stand and leave, but before she could move, Whitman entered. He nodded at her with quiet reassurance before beginning. Tonight, he said, we consider energy estimates for incompressible flows, specifically how to bound turbulence when standard methods fail. He wrote swiftly on the board. As you know, the Navier-Stokes problem asks whether smooth solutions exist for all time in 3 dimensions. But even without full smoothness, we can still study behavior through energy inequalities. Elena leaned forward, gripping her pen. She recognized the inequality he wrote. It was the one he had shown her in room 402. But now he expanded it, layering terms, adjusting conditions, explaining how certain assumptions could hold the energy finite. She scribbled furiously, each line like fire in her veins. A graduate student raised a hand. But isn't this just Laray's classical result? Weak solutions exist, but uniqueness is unknown. Whitman nodded. True, but the question is whether new structures, symmetries, decompositions might reveal hidden smoothness. We've tried many approaches. Yet sometimes the smallest shift in perspective changes everything. His eyes flicked just for a moment toward Elena. Her stomach tightened. Another student interjected. "Professor, with respect, we've been circling this for decades. What makes you think there's anything new here?" Whitman paused. "Because sometimes an outsider sees differently." A ripple of murmurs passed around the room. Elena felt her face flush. She lowered her gaze, pretending to focus on her notes. The discussion grew heated. Students debated, equations spilling across the board, chalk breaking under pressure. Words like turbulence cascade and Fourier mode decomposition filled the air. Elena tried to follow, her mind stretching, straining. Some ideas slipped past her, too quick, but others caught. She saw how energy could be tracked across scales, how larger flows fed into smaller eddies, how chaos still carried structure. At one point, Whitman posed a question. If we assume external force is bounded in L2 space, what does that suggest about the long-term behavior of the solution? Silence followed. Students exchanged uneasy glances. Then, before she could stop herself, Elena spoke. "It suggests the energy can't blow up indefinitely," she said softly. All heads turned. Her voice wavered, but she continued. "If the forcing remains bounded, then the solution's energy should converge to some upper limit. Not smoothness, maybe, but stability." The room went utterly still. One student frowned. "Who are you?" Whitman answered for her. "A student, like you." There was tension then, murmurs, skepticism, a flicker of disdain on one or two faces, but Whitman gestured for her to continue. "Go on." Elena swallowed hard. She explained haltingly how she saw energy estimates like walls around turbulence, keeping it from exploding infinitely. Her words were not polished. She stumbled on terminology, but the idea was clear. When she finished, silence lingered. Finally, one professor spoke. "It's an elementary observation," he said bluntly, "but not without value." Another professor leaned forward, studying her. "Elementary, yes. Yet we forget the elementary too easily." The discussion moved on, but Elena sat trembling, her notebook open, her pen unmoving. She felt exposed, raw but also alive. For the first time, she had spoken in the language she loved. After the seminar ended, most students filed out quickly, their voices sharp with judgment or indifference. One lingered, a tall girl with tired eyes. She approached Elena slowly. "What you said, it helped me see something. Thank you." Then she left without another word. Elena sat in the empty room long after, her hands folded in her lap. She did not know what her words had meant, or whether they mattered, but she knew she had crossed a threshold. She was no longer only an observer in the back row. She had entered the conversation. That night, as she walked home beneath the spring stars, she thought of her father's words long ago. Every wall begins with a single stone. Perhaps tonight, she had laid her first stone in the house of mathematics. By the time the next week's seminar arrived, the air in the mathematics department felt heavier. Whispers had spread more widely. Some carried curiosity, but others carried scorn. A janitor, sitting in graduate seminars, speaking on equations that had humbled the best minds for decades. To some, it was a story of inspiration. To others, it was an insult. Elena sensed the change everywhere. The glances lasted longer. Conversations hushed when she entered a room to clean. One afternoon, as she pushed her cart past the faculty lounge, she heard laughter inside. A male voice said, "Next time, maybe the cafeteria lady can lecture on general relativity." Another voice added, "Or the gardener can solve the Riemann hypothesis." The laughter stung sharp as broken glass. She kept walking, her grip on the mop handle so tight her knuckles burned white. Yet she did not stop attending class. Each morning she took her place in the back of Calculus 1, filling her notebook with limits and integrals. She studied at night, hunched over her whiteboard in the janitor's closet, rewriting Chen's lectures until her hand cramped. She whispered each theorem to herself, building the knowledge stone by stone. If others doubted her, she told herself, let them. The mathematics would not betray her, but resistance did not remain in whispers alone. At the next seminar, the tension broke. Whitman opened with a discussion of Laray's weak solutions, how Jean Laray in 1934 had shown that solutions to Navier-Stokes exist in a weak sense, though their uniqueness and smoothness remain unknown. He wrote quickly, filling the board with inequalities, norms, and functional spaces. Elena followed, her notes filling with phrases, L2 space, energy inequality, weak convergence. She knew she was only scratching the surface, but the ideas lit a fire in her. Then one of the graduate students, a tall man named Carruthers, stood. "Professor," he said, his voice edged with challenge, "may I ask why we are entertaining commentary from someone with no formal training? This is not a classroom for charity." His eyes flicked toward Elena. The room went silent. Whitman froze for a moment. Then he said evenly, "Mathematics belongs to all who seek it with honesty. Insight can come from unexpected places." Carruthers scoffed. "With respect, that is romantic nonsense. We work years to master this. To reduce it to scribbles on a blackboard by a janitor." "Enough," Whitman said sharply. But the damage was done. Murmurs rose. Some students looked at Elena with pity, others with disdain. Her cheeks burned. She wanted to vanish. When the seminar ended, she gathered her notebook quickly, slipping out before anyone could speak to her. She hurried to the quiet of the stairwell, her chest tight, her eyes wet. She pressed her forehead to the cool stone wall. Perhaps Carruthers was right. Who was she to sit among them? She had no degree, no credentials, only a mop and a stack of worn notebooks. That night, she nearly did not return to room 402. But something stronger than shame pulled her there. She unlocked the door, stood before the empty board, and took up the chalk. Slowly, she rewrote the energy inequality Whitman had discussed, a balance between the energy in the flow, the dissipation through viscosity, and the forcing that drives it. She whispered the words, "Energy cannot blow up forever. It must bend under the weight of dissipation." She thought of her own life, chaos, loss, exhaustion, and yet she had not exploded into nothingness. She had bent, endured, found stability. Was she not herself a weak solution, existing without smoothness, holding together despite turbulence? Her chalk moved faster. She wrote the inequality in terms of sequences, as Chen had taught, step by step, converging toward a bound. She did not know if it was correct. She only knew it felt alive. Behind her, a voice startled her. "You should not let them silence you." She turned. Professor Chen stood in the doorway. Her arms were folded, her face unreadable. "I heard what happened," she said. "You must understand. Academia has walls. Some are built to protect. Some are built from fear. You are knocking at those walls. They will resist." Elena lowered her eyes. "Maybe I don't belong." Chen stepped closer. "Belonging is not given. It is claimed. You do not need permission to learn. And if you have insight, no wall can erase it." Elena's throat tightened. "But I am only a janitor." Chen shook her head. "You are a student of mathematics. That is enough." For the first time in days, warmth flickered inside her. Still, the weeks that followed were heavy. Some professors avoided her, some students mocked her, but a few, quietly, cautiously, offered kindness. The girl from the seminar, the one with tired eyes, began sitting near her. Riley remained steadfast, joking that Elena should start charging for tutoring. Whitman continued to greet her with calm respect, though she could see the strain on his face. He was risking his own standing by defending her. One night, exhausted, Elena returned home and found Lucia asleep at the table, her school books spread out. Elena lifted her gently, carried her to bed, then sat staring at the child's notebook. Fractions and decimals filled the page, a line of numbers converging towards something whole. She thought of the graduate students, of Carruthers's scorn, of Whitman's defense, of Chen's quiet encouragement. Her life felt like one of those sequences, messy, stumbling, uncertain. But perhaps, like numbers, she too was converging, slowly, towards something steady. The next seminar came. Elena almost did not go. But she remembered Lucia's voice. "Be brave, Mom." She entered the room, her heart pounding. The stares came, sharp and cold. Carruthers smirked openly. But when Whitman asked a question about how forcing terms might affect long-term stability, Elena raised her hand. Her voice trembled, but she spoke. "Maybe the forcing does not break smoothness. Maybe it only shifts the equilibrium, like turbulence feeding into smaller scales but never escaping the bounds." For a moment, silence reigned. Then, surprisingly, one of the professors nodded. "An interesting analogy," he said. "Not rigorous, but evocative." Carruthers scoffed, but the words had been spoken. Elena's hands shook as she wrote the idea into her notebook. For the first time, she felt that the wall before her had not been broken, but it had cracked. That night, alone in room 402, she stared at the board. She wrote one sentence at the top: "I will not be erased." The chalk line was faint, fragile, but it was there. Outside, rain struck the windows like applause. Inside, Elena's quiet flame burned brighter than the walls that tried to contain it. The resistance did not disappear, but something else began to grow alongside it. In the weeks after Carruthers' outburst, Elena noticed quiet shifts, subtle, almost invisible at first. A professor who had avoided her in the hallway now offered a brief nod. A student who once smirked now sat silently, no longer laughing. And most importantly, a handful of people began to draw closer, as if drawn by a flame they had not expected to see. It began with Riley. The girl with the purple headphones had long been her friend in Calculus 1, but now she became Elena's fiercest defender. "Ignore them," she whispered after class one morning. "They don't know what they're talking about. You explain things better than half the TAs." She grinned, then added, "Besides, if you stop coming, who's going to rescue me from failing derivatives?" Elena laughed softly, though her heart was still heavy. Then came Lila, the graduate student with the tired eyes who had spoken to her after the seminar. One evening, Elena found her waiting outside room 402. "I've been thinking about what you said," Lila admitted. "About bounded forcing and stability. It reminded me of something I read in a paper by Constantine and Foyas. Would you like to look at it together?" They sat in the empty room, their notebooks open, their voices low. Lila explained how certain energy inequalities suggested long-term bounds on turbulent solutions, even when smoothness failed. Elena listened, asking questions, her pencil racing across the page. For the first time, she studied side by side with someone who treated her not as an intruder, but as a fellow learner. The circle widened. A week later, an older professor, Dr. Patel, known for his kindness as much as his skill, approached her quietly. "I hear you've been sitting in on our seminars," he said. Elena braced for criticism, but instead he smiled gently. Mathematics thrives when new voices enter. If you ever want to borrow books, my office door is open. Her throat tightened. She could only nod. These were small gestures, but to Elena, they felt like lanterns lit in a dark corridor. For every sneer, there was now a quiet voice of encouragement. For every wall of resistance, a door cracked open. Still, the doubts lingered. Some nights, as she mopped the silent halls, she replayed Carruthers's words in her head. "This is not your place." They echoed like a curse. But then she remembered Chen's voice. Belonging is not given, it is claimed. She remembered Whitman's steady defense, Lila's quiet invitation, Riley's stubborn loyalty. Slowly, she began to believe that perhaps she was not as alone as she had thought. Her learning deepened. In Chen's class, they moved from differentiation to integration, from slopes to areas, from single-variable functions to multivariable calculus. Elena was astonished at the unity of it all. The derivative told the story of an instant. The integral told the story of the whole. Together, they formed a language that captured both the fleeting and the eternal. She saw parallels everywhere. At work, pushing her mop, she thought, each sweep is like a derivative, a single act of change. But the shining floor at the end is the integral, the accumulation of countless tiny motions. Life itself was an integral, a sum of ordinary steps, converging toward something larger. In the seminars, Whitman pushed further into turbulence. One evening, he spoke of the energy cascade, how large eddies of fluid break down into smaller and smaller whirlpools, passing energy down the chain until it dissipates as heat. Elena sat transfixed. She thought of her own life as a cascade, grand shocks broken into smaller struggles, until the energy of grief finally settled into endurance. During the discussion, she whispered to Lila, "If turbulence cascades downward, does stability cascade upward? From the small to the large?" Lila blinked, then wrote it down. "That's an interesting way to think about it." Word of these small conversations spread. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, in the way that ideas do. A few more students began sitting near her in seminars. Not many, but enough to form what felt like a small circle of light. One afternoon, Chen asked Elena to stay after class. "I've noticed you've been studying with some of the graduate students," she said. Elena flushed, unsure if this was praise or rebuke, but Chen's eyes were kind. "That is good. Mathematics is not mastered alone. It is a community, even if it is sometimes unkind. Lean on those who respect you. Let their light carry you forward." That night, Elena returned home to find Lucia at the table with crayons and paper. "I made us," the little girl said proudly. The drawing showed two stick figures holding hands beneath a giant book. Above them, in shaky letters, Lucia had written, "Mom and me learning forever." Elena's eyes filled. She knelt, holding her daughter close. "Yes," she whispered, "forever." The next week, she dared to do something bold. At the seminar, during a heated debate about weak solutions, she raised her hand. "Maybe weak solutions are like stories told in fragments," she said softly. "They don't give every detail, but they capture the shape of the whole. They are not lies. They are incomplete truths." For a moment, silence hung. Then Patel smiled faintly. "Poetic," he said, "and not inaccurate." A few students chuckled, but not cruelly. Even Whitman allowed himself a small smile. Elena flushed, but she did not look down. She wrote the words into her notebook. Incomplete truths. She had begun to find her voice. Outside, spring flowers bloomed across Harvard Yard. Students hurried between classes, the air alive with energy. Elena still carried her mop at night, still worked long hours. But something had changed. She no longer felt like a ghost drifting through the halls. She felt like a flame, small but steady, surrounded now by other flames. Her circle was not large, it was not powerful, but it was real. And in that circle of light, Elena began to believe, not just that she could learn, but that she could belong. The notice came pinned on the board outside the mathematics office. Annual Department Colloquium. Open presentations by students. Anyone could volunteer to give a short talk, though in practice it was almost always graduate students preparing for their qualifying exams. Professors sat in the front row, taking notes, sometimes asking questions sharp as knives. For most, it was a rite of passage, a trial by fire. Elena had stopped to read the notice on her way to class. She felt her chest tighten. She had no place there, no degree, no title. And yet, the thought lingered. For weeks now, she had been speaking in whispers, in fragments, in small circles of trust. But could she stand openly, with nothing but chalk in hand, and speak her truth? That evening, Riley teased her gently. "You should do it." Elena laughed, shaking her head. "Don't be ridiculous." But Riley pressed on. "Why not? You explain things better than anyone. Half the class copies your notes, and you have something to say." Lila agreed. "If you talked about energy estimates, even in a simple way, it would mean something. Sometimes the simplest voice is the clearest." Elena resisted, but the idea took root. At night, in room 402, she found herself rehearsing alone, chalk in hand. She began with a clean board, wrote energy estimates in fluid flow, then tried to explain in plain words what it meant. How even in chaos, energy could not grow without limit. How boundaries gave shape to turbulence. She stumbled, erased, tried again. Her voice shook at first, but with each attempt, it grew steadier. Lucia noticed her practicing at home. "Are you going to be a teacher now, Mom?" she asked. Elena smiled softly. "Not a teacher, just someone trying to share what she sees." Lucia clapped her hands. "Then I'll be your student." And she sat on the floor, listening earnestly as Elena explained how water in a glass swirls, but never flies out forever. The little girl nodded solemnly, as if it all made perfect sense. The day of the colloquium arrived. Elena stood at the back of the lecture hall, her hands damp, her notebook clutched to her chest. Graduate students bustled around, adjusting laptops, whispering notes to each other. Professors sat waiting, their expressions unreadable. When Whitman saw her, he walked over. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "No, but I'm here." He smiled faintly. "That is enough." Her name was not on the printed program. But when Whitman announced the session, he added at the end, "We have one final presentation tonight, Ms. Elena Rodriguez." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. She walked to the front, her legs trembling. She picked up the chalk and faced the board. For a moment, the room swam before her. Then she remembered Lucia's voice. "Be brave, Mom." She took a deep breath and began. She wrote a simple equation on the board. Energy at time t plus dissipation equals energy at time 0 plus forcing. She turned to the audience. "This is an energy estimate. It says that even in the wildest flow, energy cannot grow without bound. Something always holds it." Murmurs moved through the room. She pressed on. "We call these weak solutions. They may not be smooth, not perfect, but they exist. They tell us that turbulence, no matter how messy, still has structure." She paused, her voice steadier now. "I think of weak solutions like incomplete truths. They don't give us every detail, but they remind us that even chaos has boundaries. She drew a curve on the board, shaded the area under it. A derivative tells you change at an instant. An integral tells you the whole story. Energy estimates are like integrals. They don't tell us every twist of the flow, but they tell us the total picture. That, to me, is hope, that even in turbulence there is stability. When she finished, silence hung. Then questions came, sharp, skeptical. Carruthers spoke first. This is philosophy, not mathematics. Where are the proofs, the rigorous arguments? Her hands shook, but she answered calmly. I don't have full proofs, not yet, but I have seen that intuition matters. Every proof begins with a question, and every question begins with a glimpse. Another professor asked, Do you know the work of Leray and Hopf? Have you studied the formal inequalities? She nodded. I've read fragments. I don't claim to master them, but I see how they echo something deeper. The fight between growth and dissipation. That fight is everywhere, in water, in air, in life itself. Patel leaned forward. Your language is not precise, but it carries something we forget, that mathematics is not only calculation, but vision. The room stirred. Some faces showed approval, others disdain. But Elena stood steady. For once she did not feel small. When the session ended, the applause was polite, uncertain. Yet Riley cheered loudly from the back, and Lila smiled with quiet pride. Whitman gave her a single nod, his eyes saying more than words. Afterward, as the hall emptied, Carruthers approached. His face was cold. This will not last, he said softly. In the end, the mathematics will not bend for you. Elena met his gaze. For the first time, she did not flinch. Then I will bend myself to the mathematics, she answered, and keep bending until I belong. That night, walking home beneath the stars, she felt lighter than she had in years. She knew she had not solved anything. She had not changed the field, but she had spoken. She had claimed her place, however small. At her apartment, Lucia was waiting, her eyes bright. How was it, Mom? Elena knelt, holding her close. It was hard, she whispered, but I was brave. Lucia grinned. Then you won? Elena smiled, tears in her eyes. Perhaps her daughter was right. The war was not over, the walls not broken. But tonight, she had walked through fire, and the flame inside her had not gone out. Spring turned to summer, and the long days carried both light and shadow for Elena. After the colloquium, she was no longer invisible. Some students nodded at her in passing. A few even asked her small questions about homework, but others avoided her with deliberate disdain. The professors remained divided. Patel and Whitman quietly supportive, others cool, dismissive. Chen stayed steady, her encouragement never wavering, though she warned Elena often, the higher you climb, the stronger the winds. Hold fast. At home, Elena tried to balance everything, her janitorial shifts, her classes, her daughter's growing needs. Lucia had started asking harder questions. Why don't you sleep, Mom? She whispered one night, seeing Elena hunched over her notebook past midnight. Elena stroked her daughter's hair and said, Because I want to show you something, that even when life makes us stop, we can start again. Lucia nodded, though her eyes showed worry. The pressure grew heavier with each passing week. Elena began attending a small study group led by Lila and a few graduate students curious enough to include her. They met in the basement library, surrounded by books older than any of them. Discussions circled around weak solutions, Sobolev spaces, and the energy cascade. Lila explained carefully how functions could live in abstract spaces defined not by their values, but by their integrability and smoothness. Elena struggled, her head pounding, but she refused to quit. She wrote in her notebook, Sobolev spaces, rooms where rough functions are allowed to stay. It was her own way of holding the idea, but she could feel the cracks forming. Long shifts left her exhausted. Some nights she stared at equations and saw only blur. She mopped floors until her wrists ached, then rushed to scribble notes before collapsing into bed. Doubts gnawed at her. Was she selfish for chasing this dream when her daughter needed her energy, her presence? Was she deluding herself, thinking she could walk a road built for those with decades of uninterrupted study? Then came the breaking point. One evening, as she cleaned the seminar room, she overheard voices through the half-closed door of the faculty lounge. "It's absurd," Carruthers' voice sneered. "We let her speak at the colloquium as if she belongs. What message does that send? That mathematics is a hobby for anyone with chalk?" Another voice, older, dry with authority, replied, "Whitman's lost his judgment. The department is not a charity. We cannot have janitors pretending to be scholars." Laughter followed. Elena froze outside the door, her mop handle trembling in her grip. The words pierced her like knives. Pretending. Charity. She pressed her forehead against the cool doorframe, her body shaking. That night she returned home hollow. She tucked Lucia into bed, then sat at the kitchen table staring at her notebooks. Equations filled the pages, limits, integrals, inequalities. But suddenly they looked meaningless, the scribbles of a fool. Tears blurred her vision. She slammed the book shut. For 2 days she did not go to class. She went through her shifts mechanically, avoiding room 402, avoiding the sight of chalk. At home, she told Lucia she was tired, too tired to study. The little girl looked at her with wide, worried eyes, but said nothing. On the third night, Whitman came looking for her. He found her sitting alone in the break room, her hands folded, her eyes hollow. He set his briefcase down and said quietly, "I've been searching for you. Chen told me you've missed class." Elena didn't look up. "They're right," she whispered. "I don't belong. I'm an intruder. A janitor pretending to be a mathematician." Whitman sat across from her. "Do you know what David Hilbert once said? He said, 'Mathematics knows no races or geographic boundaries. For mathematics, the cultural world is one country.'" He leaned closer. "It also knows no professions. What matters is the mind that seeks." Her hands shook. "But I'm failing. I don't understand half of what I read. And my daughter, she deserves better than a mother chasing impossible dreams." Whitman's eyes softened. "You think mathematicians don't fail? We fail every day. We chase problems for years, sometimes lifetimes, with nothing to show but dead ends. That is the work. Failure is not proof that you don't belong. It is proof that you are trying." Elena's voice broke. "I'm so tired." Whitman nodded. "Then rest. But don't quit. If not for yourself, then for her." He gestured toward a photograph taped to her locker. Lucia, smiling, missing a tooth. "She's watching. She will remember." That night, Elena opened her notebook again. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages. She found the folded copy of the Navier-Stokes notes, the ones that had haunted her since the beginning. She unfolded it slowly, laying it flat. She traced the words existence and smoothness with her finger. Her tears fell onto the page, smudging the ink. She whispered aloud, "Do solutions exist? Are they smooth?" And then, softer, "Do I exist? Am I smooth?" She laughed through her tears. Perhaps she too was a weak solution, imperfect, incomplete, but still alive within the inequality of life. The next morning, she returned to class. Riley grinned when she saw her. "Thought you'd left me to drown in integrals," she whispered. Elena smiled faintly. "Not yet." Chen said nothing, but her eyes warmed when they met Elena's across the room. In the seminar that evening, Patel spoke about turbulence models. He explained how energy cascades downward through scales, how chaos feeds on itself. Elena raised her hand. Her voice was still shaky, but steady enough. "If energy cascades downward, can understanding cascade upward? From the small to the large?" Patel paused, considering. "Perhaps," he said slowly. "Perhaps insight works that way." After the seminar, Elena walked home beneath the streetlights. She was still tired, still heavy with doubt. But something had shifted. She had broken, yes, but she had not shattered. She had bent and returned. She carried her notebooks close, as if they were fragile glass, but inside she felt the flame stirring again. Lucia was waiting at the window when she arrived. "Mom," she whispered as Elena entered, "I knew you'd go back." Elena gathered her into her arms, holding her close. "Yes," she said softly. "I went back." And in that embrace, Elena understood something new. Smoothness was not about perfection. It was about continuation, about moving forward, however rough, without breaking apart. Autumn settled over Cambridge, golden leaves swirling across Harvard Yard. Elena's days had become a rhythm of endurance, cleaning halls at night, sitting in classes by morning, squeezing time with Lucia between. She had not solved the Navier-Stokes problem. She had not written a single published paper. But something had changed forever. She now walked through the mathematics department not as a ghost, but as a presence. Some still doubted her, some dismissed her, but others had learned to nod, to greet, even to listen. The small circle of light she had found, Riley, Lila, Patel, Chen, Whitman, had grown steady. She was no longer entirely alone. Yet Elena felt another pull, quieter but insistent. Each time she looked at her daughter, each time she remembered the dusty roads of her childhood in El Salvador, she wondered, what good was all this knowledge if it stayed only in lecture halls and notebooks? What about the children back home, the ones like her younger self, who once loved numbers but had no chance to pursue them? The thought grew until it became decision. One evening after a seminar, she approached Whitman. "I need to go back," she said simply. He looked startled. "Back? You mean?" She nodded. "Home. To El Salvador. Or at least to the community I left behind. There are children there who have no teachers, no books. I cannot give them everything, but I can give them something." Whitman was silent for a long time. Then he said, "You will be missed here." She smiled faintly. "I was never really here, not in the way others are, but I can be there fully." In the weeks that followed, she prepared quietly. She finished her night shifts with dignity, turned in her keys, packed her worn notebooks and the rescued whiteboard she had studied on so many nights. Chen gave her a stack of used textbooks. Riley hugged her fiercely, promising to keep studying. Lila slipped a letter into her bag, a note of encouragement. Whitman pressed her hand and said only, "Keep asking questions." Lucia was nervous at first. "Mom, will I have to leave my school?" Elena kissed her forehead. "Yes, but you will gain something new. We will build something together. You will not just be a student. You will help me teach." Lucia's eyes widened, then lit with pride. They traveled south, leaving behind the brick towers of Harvard for the dry hills of a rural village. Elena's childhood home was long gone, but the land still carried the same scent of dust and earth. Children gathered curiously when she arrived, their eyes bright but wary. The first classroom was nothing more than a patch of shade beneath a tree. Elena set up the small whiteboard, propped against a stone. She wrote carefully, "Mathematics is the language of change." The children watched in silence. She drew a curve, then a line touching it. This line is slope. It tells us how something changes. Life is always changing. Mathematics helps us see it. At first, the children giggled, shy and uncertain. But as days passed, they returned eagerly. Elena taught them to count, to measure, to see patterns in the world around them. The arc of a thrown stone, the rhythm of footsteps, the way rivers curved through the earth. She explained derivatives not with symbols, but with stories. When you run, your speed changes. That change has a number. That number is your slope. She spoke, too, of turbulence in simple words. Water swirls when you stir it. It looks wild, but even wildness has rules. We may not see them all, but they are there. The children nodded, their eyes wide. At night, after the children went home, she sat with Lucia under the stars. The girl helped her sort notebooks, prepared chalk, and sometimes asked, "Mom, will you ever solve that big problem, the one with the long name?" Elena smiled gently. "Perhaps not. But maybe one of my students will. That is enough." Word spread. More children came, then parents too, curious to see what this woman taught with such quiet fire. Soon the shade of the tree was not enough. The villagers cleared a small room in the community center, brought benches, and painted the walls. Elena's whiteboard stood at the front like a beacon. One afternoon, as she explained fractions using pieces of bread, she noticed an old man watching from the doorway. His face was lined, his clothes worn. After class, he approached, speaking softly. "I never learned to read numbers. Could you teach me?" Elena's heart swelled. "Yes," she said. "It is never too late." Weeks turned to months. The classroom grew. Elena did not have polished lectures, but she had something rarer, the ability to make numbers feel like home. She told her students stories of Harvard, not of the whispers and scorn, but of the chalkboards that held mysteries, of the way equations could capture the breath of the world. She never mentioned her own pain, only the beauty she had found. And slowly, the children began to dream. One boy said, "I want to build bridges." A girl whispered, "I want to be a doctor." Another said shyly, "I want to study the stars." Elena wrote their dreams on the wall, each name beside a vision, each vision beside a number. She told them, "Mathematics is a key. You may use it to open whichever door you choose." Lucia blossomed too. She stood at the board one day, explaining to younger children how to add fractions. Elena watched, tears in her eyes. Her daughter was not only learning, she was becoming part of the chain of knowledge, carrying the flame forward. Years later, people would remember the woman who had once been a janitor at Harvard, who had sat quietly at the back of lectures, who had scribbled on chalkboards at 2 in the morning. They would say she touched the edge of great mysteries, that she carried the whisper of proofs in her hands. But Elena herself would remember something different. She would remember the faces of children beneath the tree, the warmth of their laughter, the way their eyes lit up when they saw patterns in numbers. She would remember her daughter's pride, and she would know that this was her true solution. Not a theorem written in journals, not a prize won in distant halls, but a flame passed on from one heart to another, never to be erased. On her final page of notes, she wrote, "Smoothness is not perfection. Smoothness is continuity. To continue is to exist, and existence is enough. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves. Inside, in the little classroom, a woman once called a janitor stood at the board, chalk in hand, her students leaning forward, their eyes alight with the hunger for knowledge. The flame had spread. To those who labor in silence, yet dream in light, this story is for you. To the teachers who see, the children who hope, and the parents who endure, may the flame of knowledge never fade.